There is a particular kind of sentence a man never forgets. It does not have to be cruel. It does not have to be shouted. It only has to be said by the right person at the right moment in the right tone, and it will lodge itself somewhere inside you that no amount of time fully reaches. For me, the sentence was 4 words long. It was delivered at 8:30 on a Monday morning by a man holding a paper cup of coffee in his left hand, and the words were these: "You're easily replaceable, Henry." He said it the way a person says the weather forecast. No anger, no edge, just a flat, casual delivery as if he were reading something off the back of a cereal box. He even smiled a little after he said it, the way some men smile when they think they've just been generous with their honesty. Then he took a sip of his coffee and waited to see what I would do. His name was Spencer Mallard. He was the CEO of Brennan Logistics Group, and he was 39 years old. He had been the CEO for 14 months. Before that, he had been the chief operating officer at a regional shipping firm in the Southeast that had been acquired by a larger competitor, an acquisition Spencer talked about often in meetings as though it had been a victory he personally engineered. He wore tailored shirts with no tie, a thin silver watch, and the kind of glasses that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He spoke in short, confident bursts and laughed at his own jokes a beat before anyone else did. He was the sort of man who could not stand silence in a room unless he had created it himself. I was 52. My name is Henry Whitaker. And on that Monday morning, sitting across from Spencer in a small glass-walled conference room on the 3rd floor of the Brennan Logistics headquarters, I listened to him tell me, with a coffee cup in his hand and a small smile on his face, that I was easily replaceable. He said it after I had calmly asked him to reconsider the decision to remove me from the leadership pipeline I had been promised 18 months earlier. He said it the way a man says something he believes is finally putting a stubborn old animal in its place. He said it because he genuinely believed it. I did not raise my voice. I did not shift in my chair. I did not allow my face to change. I have worked in operations and logistics long enough to know that when a man like Spencer Mallard tells you who you are, the worst thing you can do is argue with him about it. Arguments confirm to him that he matters to you. Silence confirms only what you choose to confirm. So I nodded once slowly, the way a person nods when they have just understood a piece of information they will need later. I thanked him for his time. I stood up. I buttoned my jacket. I walked out of that conference room without saying another word, and I took the stairs back down to the operations floor because the elevator that morning would have given me 3 more minutes alone with the sentence, and I did not want to be alone with it yet. What Spencer did not know, what he could not have known, what he would not begin to understand for another 6 months, was that the man he had just dismissed as easily replaceable had spent the last 23 years personally building, mapping, and maintaining the operational backbone that allowed Brennan Logistics to function on a daily basis. He did not know that the entire network of regional carrier relationships ran through phone numbers that lived in my head and not in any company database. He did not know that 3 of our largest accounts had personally requested in writing that I be the named point of contact on their service agreements. He did not know any of that because Spencer Mallard had never asked. In the 14 months he had been CEO of Brennan Logistics, he had never once sat down with me for a real conversation about what I actually did. He had inherited me the way a new homeowner inherits an old furnace in the basement. He knew the furnace was there. He knew it kept the house warm. He did not feel any particular need to understand how it worked, and he certainly did not feel any need to thank it. I want to tell you about who I was before that Monday morning, because the sentence Spencer said in that conference room did not land in a vacuum. It landed on top of a real life with real weight and real stakes, and you cannot understand what came next unless you understand what the words actually fell into. I grew up in a small town in western Pennsylvania, in a house my father had built himself with the help of his 2 brothers in the late 1960s. My father drove a delivery truck for a regional beverage distributor for 34 years. He left the house at 4:45 in the morning, 6 days a week, and came home at 6 in the evening, and in all those years I never heard him complain once about the work. My mother worked at the local elementary school as a teacher's aide and kept the household finances in a green ledger book she updated every Sunday night at the kitchen table. They were not poor exactly, but every dollar had a name and a destination before it ever entered the house. I learned how to count money before I learned how to read. What I learned from them, more than anything else, was that the dignity of a man is not built in the moments other people are watching. It is built in the long, quiet hours when no one is watching at all, when you show up, when you finish. When you do the thing right because the thing deserves to be done right, not because anyone is going to clap for you afterward. I joined Brennan Logistics 23 years ago. I was 29 years old. I came in as a regional operations coordinator, which is a fancy way of saying I was the person who answered the phone at 6 in the morning when a truck broke down outside of Harrisburg and had to figure out in real time how to get that load to its destination before the client noticed. I was good at it, not because I was brilliant, but because I was steady. I did not panic. I did not pass the problem to someone else. I solved it, and then I made a note of what I had learned, and the next time something similar happened, I solved it faster. Over 23 years, I became the person at Brennan Logistics who knew where the bodies were buried, professionally speaking. I knew which carriers in Ohio could be trusted on a tight deadline, and which ones would tell you yes on the phone and then fail to show up at the dock. I knew which clients required a courtesy phone call the moment a delivery window slipped by more than 90 minutes, and which clients preferred to be notified only when the situation was fully resolved. I knew the personal histories of the dispatchers at our top 15 accounts. I knew that the operations director at Callaway Freight had lost his wife to cancer 4 years earlier, and that he appreciated when someone remembered to ask about his daughter. I knew that the warehouse manager at Tilden Distribution preferred email over phone calls because his hearing had been damaged in the military, and he was self-conscious about it on the phone. None of that was in any official company database. None of that had ever been written into a job description or a performance review. It lived in my head, in my notebooks, in the rhythm of how I worked. And it was the thing that kept Brennan Logistics standing upright. And outside of work, there was a life that depended on the income that kept that life standing. My wife, Caroline, and I have been married for 26 years. We met when I was 25 and she was 24 at a friend's wedding in the Pocono Mountains, and I knew within about 6 weeks of meeting her that I was going to marry her. Caroline is the kind of woman who notices things other people miss. She remembers the names of the cashiers at the grocery store. She writes thank you notes by hand. She has spent the last 18 years working as a nurse at a community hospital outside of Philadelphia, and there are people walking around in our county today who are alive in part because of her. She makes a respectable income. She does not make enough to carry our household alone. We have 2 children. Our son, Brendan, is 22 years old. He graduated from college last year with a degree in mechanical engineering and is now working at his first job in a small firm outside of Pittsburgh. He is doing well, and he does not need our financial help anymore, which is one of the quiet victories of my working life. Our daughter, Hannah, is 19. She is a sophomore in college, studying nursing like her mother, and her tuition is not finished being paid for. She has another 2.5 years of school in front of her, and the cost of those years is significant, and it lands on us. We have a mortgage on a modest house in a quiet neighborhood about 35 minutes from the Brennan Logistics headquarters. We have 11 years left on the loan. We have a car payment on the vehicle Caroline drives to the hospital, and a second car, my car, which is fully paid off and which I plan to keep driving until it stops moving entirely. We have an aging parent on my side of the family, my mother, who is 81 years old and still living independently, but who will eventually need more support than she currently requires, and I am her only living child. This is the life Spencer Mallard's 4 words landed on, not a number on a spreadsheet, not an abstraction. A specific man with a specific family and specific responsibilities, and a specific understanding of what it costs, in real human terms, when the income that holds those responsibilities upright is suddenly framed as something the company can take or leave at its convenience. Brennan Logistics was not always run by men like Spencer. The company was founded in 1978 by a man named Thomas Brennan, a Korean War veteran who had spent 20 years in trucking before deciding to build something of his own. By the time I joined the company in 2002, Thomas was in his late 60s and still came into the office 4 days a week. He wore the same brown wool sweater all winter and drank coffee out of a ceramic mug that had a small chip on the rim. He knew every employee in the company by name. He knew the names of their spouses. He attended the funerals of their parents. When my father passed away 7 years into my time at Brennan, Thomas drove 3 hours to attend the service, sat in the back of the church without saying anything to anyone, signed the guest book, and quietly drove home. He never mentioned it to me afterward. I only learned he had been there when I went through the guest book a week later. Thomas Brennan retired in 2011. He sold the controlling interest of the company to a private equity group based in New York with the assurance, he told us in his last all-hands meeting, that the new owners had committed to preserving the operational culture he had built. He believed them. He was wrong, but I do not blame him. He was an honest man trying to read other honest men, and the men he was reading were not honest. Within 4 years of his departure, the original leadership team had been almost entirely replaced. Spencer Mallard arrived as the third CEO of Brennan Logistics in the post-Thomas era. The first two had been competent enough men, neither memorable nor disastrous, who had run the company on autopilot for a few years each before moving on to larger opportunities. Spencer was different from the moment he walked through the front doors. He had been hired with a mandate. The private equity group, which by then had owned Brennan for nearly 13 years, had grown impatient with the company's modest but steady growth and wanted someone who could, in the language of the official announcement, accelerate value creation and modernize the operational footprint. Spencer presented himself as exactly that someone. He was 38 years old when he took the position. He had no background in trucking, no background in freight, and no background in any business that physically moved goods from one place to another. What he had was an MBA from a respected program, a sharp instinct for managing upward, and an unshakable belief that any business problem could be solved by applying the same set of frameworks he had used at his previous companies. He spoke often about disruption and optimization and operational excellence. He used the word leverage as a verb in nearly every meeting. He had a way of nodding while you were speaking that made it clear he was not actually listening, only waiting for the moment when he could begin speaking again. In his first 90 days, Spencer commissioned what he called a comprehensive operational review. He hired an outside consulting firm at a cost that was never officially disclosed to the broader employee base, though it was widely understood to be substantial. The consultant spent 6 weeks walking through the building with laptops and clipboards and asking employees questions whose purposes were never made clear. At the end of those 6 weeks, they produced a report that recommended, among other things, a flatter organizational structure, a more aggressive performance management system, and a strategic rebalancing of senior personnel. That last phrase, strategic rebalancing of senior personnel, did most of the heavy lifting in the report. It was the phrase that meant some of the people who had built the company were going to be quietly pushed toward the door. Within 6 months of his arrival, Spencer had brought in 4 new senior hires of his own choosing. All of them were in their early to mid-30s. All of them came from outside the industry. All of them spoke the same vocabulary Spencer spoke, used the same framework Spencer used, and laughed at the same jokes Spencer told in the same beat-late rhythm. He gathered them around him the way certain men gather mirrors. They reflected him back to himself, and he found that reflection encouraging. The one who rose the fastest was a young woman named Bridget Tannehill. Bridget was 32 years old. She had a master's degree in supply chain management and had spent 4 years at a large management consulting firm before joining Brennan. She was sharp in conversation, articulate in meetings, and capable of producing slide decks that were genuinely beautiful to look at. She had never personally managed a single freight account in her life. She had never spoken to a dispatcher at 4 in the morning trying to recover a load that was sitting on the wrong side of a state line. She had never sat across from a client who was screaming about a missed delivery window and figured out, in real time, how to turn the conversation around. None of that mattered to Spencer. What mattered was that Bridget spoke Spencer's language and reflected Spencer's worldview. And within 5 months of joining the company, she had been promoted to Vice President of Operational Strategy, which was a brand new position that Spencer had created specifically for her. A month after that, in a meeting I was not invited to, the leadership pipeline that I had been told 18 months earlier I was being groomed for was quietly restructured. The role I had been promised, Director of National Operations, was folded into Bridget's expanded portfolio. I learned about it secondhand from a junior team member who assumed I already knew. I did not confront anyone about it. I want to be honest with you about that because I think it matters. I did not march into Spencer's office and demand an explanation. I did not send a sharply worded email asking for clarification. I did not pull Bridget aside in the hallway and ask her, woman to professional, whether she understood what had just happened. I absorbed it. I went back to my desk, and I kept doing the work, and I told myself that the situation might still correct itself if I remained calm and competent and visible in the right ways. I want to tell you why I did that, because I think there are men listening to this story who have done the same thing and who need to hear it named out loud. I did it because I was afraid. Not afraid of Spencer. Not afraid of losing my job, exactly. I was afraid of what it would mean about the previous 22 years if I admitted to myself that the company had changed in ways that no longer included me. I had built my identity inside that building. I had given the best working hours of my adult life to it, and to acknowledge clearly that the people now running it did not see me, did not value what I had built, and were actively shaping a future that did not contain me, was to acknowledge that something significant had ended without my permission. That is a hard thing for a man my age to absorb, and so for several months I refused to absorb it. The shift in me began quietly, in the way most real shifts begin. I did not wake up one morning and decide to change my life. I simply began noticing things I had previously been talking myself out of noticing. I noticed that I had not been invited to the last 3 quarterly strategy sessions I had attended without interruption for over a decade. I noticed that my name had been removed from the distribution list for the senior leadership weekly briefing, and that no one had thought to mention it to me. I noticed that when I sent recommendations to Spencer about a potential service issue with one of our largest accounts, the recommendations were either ignored entirely or absorbed without acknowledgement and reissued the following week as something Bridget had identified. The accumulation of these noticings is what eventually broke through the layer of denial I had been holding in place. There was no single dramatic moment. There was only the slow, undeniable arithmetic of a man finally counting honestly what was in front of him. The phone call came on a Wednesday afternoon in early September. I was at my desk reviewing carrier capacity for the upcoming holiday surge when my cell phone rang with a number I did not immediately recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. Something made me answer. The voice on the other end belonged to a man named Douglas Kerr. Douglas had been the chief operating officer at a regional freight company in New Jersey that I had done business with for nearly 15 years. He had retired 3 years earlier, or so I had thought. He had not actually retired. He had taken a senior advisory role at a company called Northway Freight Solutions, a privately held logistics firm based in Wilmington, Delaware, that had been growing aggressively over the past 5 years, and had recently secured a substantial expansion of their service territory along the eastern seaboard. Douglas was direct. He told me he had been thinking about me for several months. He told me that Northway was building out their national operations leadership team, and that the person they had originally lined up for a key role had recently accepted a position elsewhere. He told me my name had come up in 3 separate internal conversations as the obvious candidate, and that the founder of the company, a man named Walter Brennan, had personally asked Douglas to reach out to me. He asked me if I would be willing to have a conversation. He said he was not asking me to commit to anything. He was asking me to listen. I told him I would listen. I told him I needed to be honest about where I was, which was still employed at Brennan, still going through whatever the current arrangement was and not actively looking. He said he understood completely. He said that was actually the kind of candidate Northway was most interested in talking to, people who were not desperate. People who had built something somewhere and were thinking carefully about what came next. We scheduled an initial call for the following Tuesday evening, after work hours, at a time that would not interfere with my responsibilities at Brennan. That first conversation lasted nearly 2 hours. I had expected a 15-minute introductory call. Instead, Douglas and I went through the actual substance of what Northway was building, what the role would require, what their existing operational structure looked like, and where they saw the gaps in their leadership bench. He did not soft sell anything. He told me plainly that the role would be demanding. He told me that the company was growing fast enough that there would be real pressure to deliver results within the first 18 months. He told me that the founder, Walter Brennan, had built the company on principles that he believed were closer to the way Thomas Brennan had originally built our own company before the private equity acquisition. That last detail is worth pausing on because it caught me by surprise during the call. I asked Douglas whether Walter Brennan was related to Thomas Brennan. There was a brief silence on the line, and then Douglas told me that, yes, Walter was Thomas Brennan's nephew. Thomas's younger brother's son. Walter had spent 15 years working in the trucking industry on the West Coast before returning east in his early 40s to start Northway. He had built the company with his own savings, with the same kind of slow, careful, relationship-based approach his uncle had used. I had not known any of that. Thomas had never mentioned a nephew during all the years I had known him. The world has a way of being smaller than you think it is when you have spent enough years in one industry. Over the next 10 weeks, I went through 5 separate conversations with Northway. 2 were with Douglas. 2 were with the chief operations officer, a woman named Patricia Lindstrom who had spent 28 years in freight logistics and who asked me questions during our second call that no one had asked me in 15 years. She wanted to understand how I thought. She wanted to know what I would do in specific operational scenarios. She wanted to know how I built relationships with carriers, how I managed conflict between dispatchers and account managers, how I decided when to escalate a service issue to a client and when to handle it quietly. The final conversation was with Walter Brennan himself, over dinner at a small restaurant in Wilmington on a Tuesday evening in late February. He was 52 years old, the same age I was. He looked nothing like his uncle except around the eyes. He spoke quietly, listened more than he talked, and asked me at one point in the evening what I would want from the next chapter of my professional life if I could write it on a clean piece of paper. I told him. I told him I wanted to work in a place where the work was seen. I told him I wanted to build something that would still be functioning correctly 20 years after I left it. I told him I wanted to be part of a leadership team that understood that people who knew how to actually do the work were not interchangeable, regardless of what any organizational chart suggested. He nodded slowly throughout. He did not interrupt me once. When I finished, he set down his water glass and told me that the formal offer would be in my inbox by Friday afternoon. It was. The base salary was $186,000. My salary at Brennan was $142,000. The offer included a performance bonus structure, equity in the privately held company, and full benefits. I sat with the offer for 4 days before signing it. I want to be honest about that too, because the temptation to tell this story as though I marched home and signed it that same evening would be a kind of revision I do not want to commit to. I am 52 years old. I had been at Brennan Logistics for 23 years. I had given that company the bulk of my adult working life. Walking away from it, even towards something better, even towards something that was clearly the right decision, required a few nights of sitting with the weight of it. Caroline knew about the offer from the day it arrived. She did not push me. She told me she trusted whatever I decided, and that whatever I decided, we would be fine. That kind of patience is one of the great quiet gifts of a long marriage, and I do not take it for granted. I signed the offer on a Sunday evening at the kitchen table. My start date at Northway was set for the first Monday of April, which gave me a clean 4-week notice period to provide to Brennan. My plan was straightforward. I would request a one-on-one meeting with Spencer first thing Monday morning. I would inform him of my resignation calmly and professionally. I would offer to provide a thorough handoff over the 4 weeks. I would walk out with my reputation intact and my conscience clear. That was the plan. Spencer, as it turned out, had a different plan for the same Monday morning. When I arrived at the office at 7:45 that morning, there was already a meeting invitation on my calendar that had been sent at 6:12 a.m. The meeting was titled, in Spencer's typical style, Brief Alignment Conversation. It was scheduled for 8:30. The conference room listed was the small glass-walled room on the 3rd floor. There was no agenda attached and no advance context provided. I sat at my desk and read the invitation 3 times before I understood what was happening. Spencer had decided to have his own conversation with me before I had a chance to have mine with him. I knew immediately what the meeting was going to be about, because I had been in enough corporate environments to recognize the shape of it. Spencer was going to formally communicate the leadership pipeline restructure that I had only learned about secondhand. He was going to deliver it in the professionally polished language that men like him are trained to deliver such news in. He was going to give me the version of the story that the company wanted on the record. I sat at my desk for the next 40 minutes and made a small decision. I decided that before resigning, I would do something I had not done in 18 months of watching myself be slowly written out of the future of that company. I would speak plainly, just once, just to see what would happen. I would ask Spencer directly and without any softening language to reconsider the decision to remove me from the leadership pipeline I had been promised. I would not beg. I would not negotiate. I would simply give him one clear opportunity to look across the desk at the man who had spent 23 years holding the operational backbone of his company together and decide whether that man was worth keeping or not. I want to be honest about why I did this. It was not because I expected him to change his mind. By that point, I think a quiet part of me already knew that he would not. I did it because I wanted to know with absolute certainty what kind of man I was actually working for. I wanted to remove the last shred of ambiguity. I wanted to give him the cleanest possible chance to be a different version of himself than I had come to believe he was, so that whatever decision I made afterward would be made with full clarity. He gave me my answer at 8:30 that morning, 4 words, a coffee cup, a small, comfortable smile. You're easily replaceable, Henry. I walked out of that conference room and back to my desk, and I sat down and I opened my email and I wrote my resignation letter. I kept it short. I thanked Brennan Logistics for the opportunity. I confirmed that I would be leaving the company to pursue a new professional path. I stated that my last day would be exactly 4 weeks from that Monday, in accordance with my standing agreement with the company. I did not mention the meeting that had just occurred. I did not mention Spencer by name. I did not editorialize, complain, or explain. I attached nothing. I sent it to Spencer and copied Human Resources at 9:47 in the morning, which was approximately 75 minutes after he had told me I was easily replaceable. Spencer did not respond for the rest of the day. I learned later that he had walked into the head of Human Resources office shortly after receiving the email and asked, with what I am told was genuine confusion in his voice, whether this kind of thing happened often. The HR director, a man named Edward Reyes, who had been at Brennan for 12 years and who had always treated me with quiet respect, apparently told him that no, it did not, and that he would handle the transition personally. Edward came to my desk at 4:15 that afternoon. He did not ask me any questions about why I was leaving. He did not try to talk me out of it. He sat in the empty chair next to my workspace, asked me if I was all right, and then asked me what I needed from him over the next 4 weeks to make the transition as clean as possible. I told him. He took notes on a small pad of paper. Before he stood up, he reached across and shook my hand and told me quietly that he was sorry to see me go. He did not say what he was sorry about specifically. He did not need to. The 4 weeks that followed were the strangest professional period of my career. The news of my resignation spread through the building by the end of the first day. By Wednesday morning, I had been stopped 6 separate times by colleagues asking me in various tones whether the news was real. A few were genuinely surprised, most were not. One of the older dispatchers, a man named Curtis who had worked alongside me for 19 years, came to my desk on Thursday afternoon, closed the door, sat down in the chair across from mine, and said only this. "They have no idea what they just lost, Henry." I told him I appreciated him saying so. I did not tell him that I already knew. The dynamic with Bridget Tannehill during those 4 weeks was instructive. From the day my resignation became public, Bridget began appearing at my workspace with questions. Not casual questions, specific operational questions. Questions about which carrier representatives could be trusted with last-minute capacity requests. Questions about the unwritten escalation protocols for our top accounts. Questions about who, specifically at Callaway Freight, should be contacted in the event of a service disruption, and whether email or phone was preferred, and at what time of day. She came to my desk 14 times over those 4 weeks. I counted, the same way Marcus Callaway counted Gavin's visits in the story I had once read on the internet and forgotten until I lived my own version of it. I answered every question completely and honestly. I'm not the kind of man who withholds information out of spite. I built a thorough handoff document over those 4 weeks, more than 60 pages long, containing every operational detail I could transfer in writing. I included the names of the contacts. I included their preferences. I included the histories of the relationships where the histories were relevant. I gave Bridget everything I could put into words. What I could not give her was the 23 years of context that had made those words make sense. That part was not transferable. It had to be lived to be understood, and Bridget had not lived it, and no document was going to fix that. My last day at Brennan was a Friday in early April. I arrived at the same time I always did. I made coffee in the same break room. I sat at my desk for the final morning and reviewed the handoff document one last time, made 2 small corrections, and submitted the final version to Edward in HR. At noon, a small group of colleagues, the ones I had genuinely worked with closely over the years, took me out to a long lunch at a diner near the office. There were 9 of us. We did not talk about Spencer. We did not talk about Bridget. We talked about the trucks that had broken down in memorable places, the clients who had become friends, the funny things that had happened in the dispatch room at 3 in the morning over the course of 2 decades. It was a good lunch. At 4:30 that afternoon, I cleared my desk, shook hands with the people I respected, and walked out of the Brennan Logistics building for the last time. Spencer did not come to say goodbye. He had not spoken a single word to me since the meeting on Monday morning 4 weeks earlier. I did not expect him to, and I was not disappointed when he did not. I started at Northway the following Monday. The first 90 days were the kind of professional experience I had begun to doubt I would ever have again. I was given real responsibility from the first week. My recommendations were not just heard, they were implemented. Patricia Lindstrom, the Chief Operations Officer, met with me every Friday afternoon for a 45-minute conversation about what was working and what was not, and she listened to me the way Thomas Brennan used to listen to me, fully and without distraction. Walter Brennan stopped by my office in the third week to ask me how I was settling in. He did not stay long. He just wanted to see for himself. What was happening at Brennan Logistics during those first 90 days I learned about in pieces, from former colleagues who reached out, from industry contacts who passed along what they heard, and eventually from Edward Reyes himself, who I had stayed in respectful occasional contact with. I did not seek any of it out. The information arrived on its own. Within 6 weeks of my departure, 2 of Brennan's top 15 accounts experienced significant service disruptions. The disruptions were not catastrophic, but they were serious enough to require client-facing apologies from senior leadership and credits applied to the next month's billing. One of those accounts, Callaway Freight, formally requested a meeting with Spencer to discuss the state of the relationship. Within 4 months, Brennan had hired a replacement for my role. He lasted 6 weeks before he resigned, citing what he described in his exit conversation as a fundamental misalignment between the stated scope of the role and the actual operational reality of the position. They hired a second replacement. She lasted 11 weeks before stepping away for what was officially announced as a family medical situation, though those familiar with the circumstances understood there were additional factors. They hired a third replacement, an experienced operations director who had been recruited away from a competing firm with a significant signing incentive. He was still in the role at the 6-month mark, but those who worked with him directly described him, in the polite language people use about colleagues they do not want to criticize publicly, as still finding his footing. 3 hires, 6 months. None of them able to do what one steady, overlooked, easily replaceable man had been doing for 23 years. Bridget Tannehill remained in her position throughout, but the scope of her portfolio was quietly trimmed twice in those 6 months. The leadership pipeline that had absorbed my role was restructured a second time. The phrase strategic rebalancing of senior personnel began circulating again in the building, this time pointed in a different direction. Spencer Mallard was still the CEO. As of the time I am telling this story, he is still the CEO. But the private equity group, I have been told quietly, has begun asking questions. It has been a little over a year now since I walked out of the Brennan Logistics building for the last time. I want to be careful about how I close this story, because the easy version, the satisfying version, the version that delivers a clean ending with a bow on top, is not quite the honest version. The honest version is more complicated, and I think more useful to the men who are listening to this who recognize some part of themselves in what I have described. The honest version is this. I gave 23 years of my life to a company that, by the end, was being run by a man who genuinely believed I was easily replaceable. That is a long time. That is more than a third of an average lifespan. Those years do not come back. The energy I spent in my 40s making myself indispensable inside a building that, by my late 40s, had begun to stop seeing me, was real energy from a real life that I will not get a second draft of. Northway is a good place. Walter Brennan is a good man. The work I am doing now is the kind of work I always hoped I would be doing. But none of that erases the previous chapter. It only follows it. The lesson I carry now, and the one I want to leave with you, is not the lesson of revenge. Spencer Mallard is not at the center of this story, even though it might seem like he is. The lesson is not about him. The lesson is about me, and about every man like me who has sat in a chair across from a man like Spencer and listened to a sentence land that should have arrived years earlier, in a different form, from inside himself. The truth is that Spencer did not tell me I was easily replaceable. Spencer only said the sentence out loud. I had been telling myself a version of that same sentence for years. Every time I let an overlooked recommendation slide. Every time I watched my work absorbed into someone else's slide deck and said nothing. Every time I told myself that staying was loyalty and that loyalty was strength, when in fact in those particular years in that particular building, staying was just fear with better posture. The damage Spencer did was real, but it was small. The damage I did to myself by remaining inside a structure that had stopped seeing me long before he ever arrived was larger. That is the harder thing to say, and I am saying it because it is true. If you are a man in your 40s or 50s and you are listening to this, and some part of what I have described feels uncomfortably familiar to you, I want to say something to you directly. When the people you work for show you, clearly and without ambiguity, what they think you are worth. Believe them the first time. Not the polished version of them. Not the version that uses the right language in the meetings. The version that sits across the desk from you and reduces you to 4 flat words while holding a coffee cup. That version is telling you the truth. Listen to it, and then make whatever quiet, careful, deliberate decisions you need to make to remove yourself from a room that has already removed you in every way that mattered. Caroline is well. Her work at the hospital continues to be a source of meaning to her, and the financial pressure that had begun to wear on us in the last few years at Brennan has eased considerably. Hannah is thriving in her nursing program and is on schedule to graduate in 2 years. Brendan came home for a long weekend last month, and we spent most of it in the garage, working on a small woodworking project he had been wanting to build. My mother is still in her own home, with a little more support now than she had a year ago, and she is doing fine. I am no longer invisible. That is not a small thing. That is everything. If this story meant something to you, please consider liking the video, sharing it with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribing to the channel for more stories like this one. Leave a comment below and tell me, if you feel comfortable, whether you have ever sat in a room and heard a sentence like the one Spencer Mallard said to me that Monday morning. I read every comment. Take care of yourself out there.